Hey guys, and welcome back to Disgustingly Easy, the podcast for women who are in it for the long game. Today's episode is a personal one. I mean, aren't they all in one way or another? This week, after everyone on Instagram actually voted for this topic, I'll be honest, I sat with it for a while feeling a little bit stumped about how I was going to approach it. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because this story isn't neat. It doesn't move in a straight line, and it definitely doesn't feel like it can be reduced to a checklist of tidy before and after traits. So what you're going to get today is the most honest version I can offer. This episode is about learning that I'm autistic later in life and what that realization has meant for me, how I've recontextualized my childhood, my relationships, my body, my nervous system, my work, and the way I live now. Before I go any further, I do want to pause and give a proper content note or trigger warning. In this episode, I speak about experiences of depression, eating disorder, and self-harm. I won't go into graphic detail, but these experiences are a part of my story and they are named. Please take care of yourself as you listen. Pause if you need to, skip sections if it feels more supportive, or come back to this episode at another time. And I want to name something else as well. Listening to this may lead you to start questioning your own past, your sensitivity, your burnout, your relationships. And if that happens, please take care of yourself in that process too. This episode isn't diagnostic advice, and I'm not here to tell you who you are. It's simply my story about finding a language later in life, about what happens when decades of coping finally stop working, and the quiet relief that can come when your experiences are finally allowed to make sense. You don't need to relate to everything I share, but if parts of it feel familiar, you're not alone. I'm sharing this because representation of autistic women is still painfully limited, and because so many of us don't realize what we've been carrying until our bodies stop letting us ignore it. Take breaks if you need them, come back if you want to. And I have gone ahead and split this episode into parts 1 and parts 2 because it is, by no word of a lie, a journey. Here is part 1. I didn't know growing up that I was autistic. I grew up thinking I was different, often difficult, emotional, way too sensitive, too dramatic. I was someone who could achieve highly and appear capable and competent while also feeling like I was quietly falling apart in ways that I couldn't explain. For a long time, I thought I had my answer. I thought I was a highly sensitive person. A coach had mentioned it to me years ago, and I read about it, did quizzes, and honestly, it fit enough. It explained why loud TV at my parents' house made me feel like my nervous system was being scraped raw, why mess overwhelmed me, why I was so affected by other people's moods, why I felt everything so deeply: joy, sadness, emotional nuance. I started identifying as a highly sensitive person, or jokingly as a HS, as an empath. And once that label was in place, I never once entertained the idea that I could be autistic, because autism, as I understood it at the time, looked very specific and it didn't look like me. Then when I was 34, I finally downloaded TikTok. And one completely ordinary morning, I was sitting on the couch watching my son sleep, scrolling, and I came across a creator whose opening line, no joke, went, "You're not highly sensitive, you're autistic." And she went on to explain in her TikTok how high sensitivity often becomes a palatable alternative, a way of talking about nervous system differences without touching on disability, ableism, or any sense of limitation. And I remember feeling like something underneath me just cracked open, like the world was going to swallow me up. I went straight into my browser and I typed online autism test. I took one and then another and then another. And every single one came back the same: extremely high scores, top percentiles, recommendations to pursue further assessment. And I disappeared down this internet rabbit hole of Reddit threads, research papers, lived experience essays, writings on female and masked presentations of autism. It felt like my entire past was quietly rearranging itself. Because when I look back on school now, so much of it makes sense in a way it never did at the time. On the surface, I was a high achiever. I was very process driven. I got good marks. I was a HD student, the kind of kid that teachers liked because I followed instructions, I took things seriously, and I could be relied on. What I understand now is that academic performance became one of the earliest ways I knew how to source validation. And I learned very young that if I did well, if I was clever, organized, diligent, I would be seen and I would be praised and I would be valued in a way that felt predictable and safe. And that validation filled something important, because while I could perform academically, I struggled with connection. I didn't experience friendships in the way other girls seemed to. I didn't intuitively understand group dynamics or hierarchies or the unspoken rules that everyone else appeared to just get. So achievement became like a substitute. When connection felt confusing or out of reach, doing well gave me a sense of worth. It gave me a role that made sense. It gave me something concrete to hold on to when relationships felt unstable or overwhelming. Food was another place that it showed up early. I was always particular. Certain textures made me gag, smells really mattered, foods I could barely think to touch. Some things just felt wrong in my mouth in a way that I could not override, no matter how many times I tried to. At the time, this was chalked up to fussiness or preference, but looking back, it was so sensory. Becoming a vegetarian in around year 6 gave that particularity a socially acceptable shape. It looked ethical, principled, admirable maybe, and it meant that I could opt out of an entire category of food that I just hated eating without needing to explain what was happening inside my body. And even at the time, I couldn't really explain it anyway, but no one questioned it. And in fact, I felt in some ways that I could practice some kind of moral superiority. And I learned quickly that when my internal experiences could be wrapped up in a story that made sense to other people, it was much easier for me to get it across. At the same time, friendships were hard in ways that I couldn't articulate. I gravitated towards one particular friend at a time. I craved depth and closeness, predictability. One-to-one connection felt manageable and nourishing, while group dynamics felt overwhelming. There was too many variables, too much emotional noise, too much noise in general, and too much for me to keep track of all at once. I didn't really like it when my friends had other friends, not out of jealousy, just because every additional person changed the emotional landscape and introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty didn't feel safe. I didn't have a language for any of this back then, but what I did have was a growing sense that I needed to watch people. Paid close attention to how people spoke when they laughed, how conflict was managed, who was included and who wasn't. It felt like learning a system that I could maybe understand if I studied hard enough. Looking back, it's very clear to me that this was like neurodivergent 101. There's even one experience from year 9 that still sits heavy with me. I was part of a close-knit group of girls who'd been together since early primary school. We're talking friends since year 2. Like most teenage groups, there were shifting loyalties, unspoken rules I found incredibly hard to keep up with. 2 friends were in conflict. One was being, in hindsight, quite a bitch. The other one was dealing with a lot at home, and I could see that she was struggling. Something that I found really easy as a child and as a grown-up still was to be able to see things that sometimes other people couldn't. One afternoon, I went for a walk with a friend who was struggling, and that night, for lack of a better word, bitchy friend pushed me for information. She called me, she kept asking questions, and I genuinely believed that if I explained or offered context, I might soften things or restore harmony. My intention was care and cohesion, and the next day it was framed as a betrayal. One friend told the other friend everything that I'd said, and the group split almost immediately and never recovered. I was heartbroken, devastated, deeply confused about how I'd led this to happen. And at the time, I took this as more evidence that there was something wrong with me, that even when I tried to do the right thing, somehow I still got it wrong. Looking back at that through an autistic lens, I can see it for what it is. Literal thinking, deep empathy, good intentions, the fact that when pressed, I'm often someone who will just keep giving more and more information until I feel like a situation has been resolved. But all of that colliding with social rules that I was never explicitly taught and didn't really understand. But back then, all I had was confusion and an even stronger pull towards achievement as the place where things made sense. There were other markers in childhood too, quieter ones that confused my family at the time. So one of the clearest ones that I think back to is when I used to go to this amazing week-long music camp. It still runs. It's called Border Music Camp. It's genuinely incredible. And it was for a week in the June, July school holidays. I would be there from 8:30 in the morning till 9 o'clock at night, and I loved it so much. We would just play music. There was rehearsals, ensembles, constant stimulation, and every year without fail, by the final day, I would be sick. Not with a cold or a flu, but like this deep gastrointestinal pain that no one could quite explain. And it happened year after year after year. I remember standing on stage in the final concert one year, timpani mallets in hand, playing something huge like a Shostakovich piece, thinking, don't pass out, just get through. Not because I was anxious about performing. I loved it, but because my body felt like it was not coping at all. 2 days later, we'd fly up to Noosa every single holidays, and I'd spend most of that week, that second week of the holidays, sick, run down, and flat because I was totally depleted. Looking back, it's so clear. It wasn't a weakness and I wasn't being dramatic. It was 6 days of sustained sensory, cognitive, and social load without recovery. And what we know, or we now understand about autism and autistic burnout, is that prolonged nervous system overload doesn't just show up emotionally. It often manifests physically, particularly through the gut immune system and collapse level fatigue. And that's why burnout, it becomes present in our 30s, right? Because eventually the system that's been compensating, masking, and pushing through since childhood can't keep going. What I didn't understand at the time was how much effort all of the things that I love to do required. The monitoring, the analyzing, the reliance on achievement to feel secure when connection felt unreliable. From the outside, I looked like a kid doing well. On the inside, I was, as I moved towards the end of high school, running close to the edge of my capacity. There was no real rest, no place to stop adjusting or stop analyzing or stop looking out into the world and trying to work out how I fit. So when something bigger entered the picture, something that challenged my sense of safety and justice in the world, there was nothing left to buffer the impact. This is where depression crept in for me. And there's another layer that is really important to name. So neurodivergent people often have a really strong sense of social justice, a strong social justice compass, a clear sense of right and wrong, and a deep intolerance for harm, hypocrisy, abuses of power. Looking back, that was definitely always there for me. As a kid, I raged a lot. I wrote letters to the Prime Minister. I went to protests with my parents. I cared, sometimes painfully, deeply about fairness and injustice. And I used to look back on that and think about it framed through the lens of being a martial artist. Karate gave me structure, ethics, discipline, and a moral code. It made sense that I felt strongly about justice in that context. But what I understand now is that it wasn't just the values of martial arts or my upbringing. It was the neurodivergent, rule-based nervous system that felt injustice in a very embodied way, without filters, without buffers. So when the Iraq War began, something inside me collapsed. And it's such a specific example. It wasn't about political disagreement. It was like my internal rule system colliding with the reality of what humans were capable of. I remember hearing a story about a young girl, younger than me at the time, being shot because someone thought her school bag contained a bomb when it was just her books. And that story just broke something inside of me because I couldn't make it make sense. I couldn't reconcile it with any internal logic I had. I stopped sleeping at night. I wanted to sleep all day. I felt heavy, foggy, overwhelmed in a way that I hadn't known before. I was still performing at school mostly, still achieving, but at home falling apart. My meltdowns becoming deeply internal. My ears rang, my body tingled. I felt like I was going to explode out of my skin at times. And that's when I started self-harming. Not because I wanted to die ever. And not because I hated myself, it just felt like releasing pressure, like giving my nervous system a way to discharge the energy that it couldn't otherwise move. And it wasn't only about the social justice piece, that was the spark, but the fuel underneath it was everything else that I couldn't name at the time. The overwhelm I felt, the built up anxiety, the constant frustration of trying to keep it together, the way it felt to be on all day at school, performing, monitoring, getting it right, being smart, being clever, being all the things that I thought I identified as, doing the social thing, and then coming home and having absolutely nothing left. I didn't have the language for masking back then, but that's what was happening. I was managing myself constantly, trying to fit in, trying not to be too much, trying not to get it wrong. And when you're holding that much in your body all day, eventually something has to give. Self-harm became the way I dealt with the internal buildup, not because I wanted attention, not because I was trying to make a statement. It was a private pressure valve, a way to turn down the volume when everything inside me felt too loud and I didn't know how else to cope. Other girls were doing it too. So it was disturbingly normalized at the time. Like it was just part of being a teenage girl, part of being emotional, part of being dramatic, but I still have scars. And for a long time, it was framed as that teenage angst or being too emotional. But looking back now, it's clear that this wasn't a personal flaw. It was a neurodivergent system trying to survive overwhelm when I didn't have the language, didn't have the tools, or a safe way to discharge all of the energy that I was carrying. And it didn't stay in that place forever. I stopped self-harming around year 11 and 12, not because everything suddenly resolved, but because I had worked out by that point how to reorganize my life in a way that started to feel more survivable. I focused harder on my studies. I found my people, the artsy, queer kids who were just a little bit outside the mainstream and far less interested in social hierarchy. I had a boyfriend at the time, and for the first time in a while, there was a sense of belonging that didn't feel like constant work. Year 12 itself, in a lot of ways, was actually pretty enjoyable. And that's important because it's easy to look back and think that the struggle just kept escalating without relief, but that's not true. What actually happened was that when my environment matched my nervous system better, I stabilized. I was still intense, still driven, still very focused on achievement, especially around my ATAR or UAI as it was back then. I was consumed with making sure it reflected my intelligence because by then academic performance had become not just something I was good at, but something I relied on to feel okay about myself. But I also, without realizing it, built scaffolding. My time was structured. My subjects were chosen carefully based off the things that I was actually interested in. My social world was smaller and more predictable. And I knew where I needed to be and when, and that made a huge difference. When year 12 finished, I took a gap year. At the time, I thought that that was just the plan. And you might have read about this in one of my Substacks. It was what I thought my friends were doing, what my boyfriend at the time was going to do. We'd talked about it, joked about it, spoken about traveling, taking a break before university. Like it was a shared understanding. We were going to be these Sydney bohemians drinking and listening to Rent on repeat, right? What I didn't realize until much later was that I took all of that very literally. Surprise, surprise, another autistic trait. The jokes, the talk, the bohemian share house. And when the next year after school finish actually came around, everyone just quietly pivoted and went off to uni, and they followed different timelines. And I was kind of left in this strange in-between place wondering what I was supposed to be doing now. I spent a lot of that year flailing, trying things, waiting for something to click, feeling like I was behind without really understanding why. Looking back, it was the first time I'd felt that absence of structure, not in a dramatic way, but in this constant low-level disorientation. Like everyone else had the same instruction manual for what we were supposed to do next, and I had just missed the page where the next steps were explained. University, which I did the following year, took that feeling and just dialed it all the way up to 11. Because when I got there, that was where the scaffolding didn't just thin out, it just disappeared overnight. Because I lived for a year at Wesley College at Sydney Uni, and honestly, the environment was chaos. The culture completely revolved around drinking, drugs, and this really casual entitlement from all the private school boys where sexual harassment was just treated as the norm. And if you didn't want to hook up or play along, you were definitely framed as uptight or difficult. If you went to a Melbourne college, you might think that you know what I'm talking about. However, the Sydney colleges took that and turned it all the way up to 11. I just didn't fit in. I cared about my studies. I wanted to learn. And don't get me wrong, like I drank, and sometimes I drank a lot. I wasn't a total nerd, but even then I had limits. And when I hit them, I needed quiet and I needed space. It was the first time in my life that I was consciously choosing not to fit in socially in order to protect something that mattered more to me. The choice was uncomfortable. I don't have friendships from that time, not because I didn't try, but because the cost of belonging felt higher than the benefit. As uni went on, things started to unravel even more in my second year. I remember driving back from Canberra to Sydney at one point and having this thought that still shocks me to think about was that if I just crushed my car just a little, not badly, just enough that I might get a break, not to die, just enough to take the pressure off, to get some time off, I started having anxiety and what I now recognize as autistic meltdown experiences, where my thoughts would turn the volume all the way up and I couldn't turn them back down. Everything felt loud, fast, like it was too much. It was just like how I'd experienced them as a teenager. The pressure would build and build and build. And as that anxiety grew, my relationship with food tightened right alongside it. Restriction became more intense, more rigid, more controlling. At the time, I didn't see it as something separate. It felt like a way of managing the overwhelm, something I could organize when everything else felt completely out of control. Eating less quietened things temporarily, and it gave me a sense of order, of containment, of being able to do something right when my internal world felt chaotic. I was I eventually got down to 20 kilos smaller than I am now. And the praise that came with that didn't feel new. It was familiar as well. It landed in the same place as that academic achievement, approval, validation, a sense of being okay. What I couldn't see then was how the anxiety and the restriction were feeding each other. The more anxious I became, the tighter the control. The tighter the control, the more brittle my nervous system. This was a self perpetuating cycle, but from the inside, it just felt like what I needed to do for survival. When my second year exams came around, I was so incapacitated with anxiety that I couldn't even write my name on my paper, let alone complete the paper, and my mind would just stall completely. I went to a counselor and tried to explain what was happening, and she just told me that everyone experiences anxiety from time to time, that I'd probably be fine, and that I just needed to chill out. This was my first experience seeing a mental health professional, where I now realize I so heavily masked. They were like, "You seem fine. What's wrong?" I would come out from the appointment realizing I hadn't really told them the full story, or that I'd played it down. And I'd think, why did I do that? So in second year, I dropped out of my arts course in Sydney and I moved to Melbourne in what was now a very on brand behavior for me. I immediately restructured my entire life. I enrolled in a double bachelor's at Monash completely remotely while working full time in a cafe, because apparently I thought rest was completely optional when you were 22. And at this time, this felt like a great reset, a way to regain control. And in some ways, it worked. Being able to study remotely removed a huge amount of social and sensory pressure. But what I didn't see then was what I was compensating again by pushing harder, relying on discipline and output instead of recovery. After graduating, I moved into child protection work purely because of the praise. I'd done my placement there and was routinely commended on what a great worker I would be. And again, that praise felt like connection, and connection felt like crack. So the second my placement was over, I applied to work there, wide-eyed and idealistic. On paper, it made complete sense. I was meticulous, highly organized, deeply process-driven. I remembered details other people missed: birthdays, case numbers, complex histories. My court report writing was often described as being far more advanced than my level of experience. And again, praised for my competence. What I couldn't see at the time was how directly this work sat on top of my social justice wiring. That same uncompromising sense of right and wrong that had been there since I was a kid was now being activated every single day. In child protection, you're not just exposed to individual trauma, you're exposed to systemic injustice, the way harm is minimized, delayed, the way things are buried in bureaucracy. And I didn't have a way of partially engaging with that. If something was wrong, I felt it fully in my body, in my thoughts, in my sleep. Clocking off on a Friday, my nervous system carried that worry all through the weekend. Burnout crept in slowly. I started checking out or dissociating at home, zoning out, losing chunks of time, feeling unreal in my body. I was going to CrossFit 5 days a week, convincing everyone that I was just being healthy, while my diet had once again become incredibly restrictive, and my eating disorder behaviors from my teenage and early 20s morphed into this orthorexic, clean eats approach that people would revere and envy. But I was just seeking to have more and more control over my life in order to quell the anxiety. I was having panic attacks at the thought of client safety over the weekends, vigilance that never switched off. And it all came to a head when my boyfriend, now husband, and my housemate pulled me aside because I nearly set the house on fire, leaving a tea towel near a lit stove. And I had absolutely no memory of putting it there. That's how far gone I was. Not visibly falling apart, not dramatic, but still masking heavily every day and operating well beyond my capacity, to the point where my brain was literally checking out. At the time, both I and others framed this as me caring too much, being too emotional, taking things too personally. So while I was being praised for my diligence and my depth of care, I was also criticized for reacting too strongly, for letting the work affect me, for not being able to say, as they would constantly say in the office, hack it. Looking back now, it's painfully clear that the thing that made me good at the job was also what made it neurologically unsustainable and unsafe. And when my nervous system finally ran out of capacity, that collapse was framed as a personal issue, not a predictable outcome of prolonged exposure to injustice without adequate support. I went to the doctor one Monday to get a medical certificate so that I could have the day off. I couldn't face going into work, and I left with a certificate that covered the next 4 weeks. And after that, I never returned. After a few months off, I enrolled in my PT certificate studies. I wanted a life that made sense. I wanted a body that felt like mine again, something that wasn't a constant crisis or constant harm. And I also found another job through Seek. It wasn't a typical role. And for reasons you'll understand, I'm not going to name the workplace or explain exactly what the job was. But that's where I'm going to pause part one, because the next part is where things get a little bit darker, and that deserves its own space, its own breath, or its own container. So if you've listened this far, thank you for being here. Take care of yourself after this episode. Take a walk, drink something, let your nervous system come down. If you see yourself in my words, please feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. Let me know what parts of the story you identify with, if you have any questions, but all will be revealed and answered when we step into part two, which is where I talk about the job I got after child protection, what happened there, and how the next decade of my life started to finally make sense in a way it never had before.